Chapter 1. The House with a Secret by Victor Hugo from the book Les Misérables. About the middle of the last century, a chief justice in the Parliament of Paris having a mistress and concealing the fact, for at that period the grand seigneurs displayed their mistresses, and the bourgeois concealed them, had a little house built in the Faubourg Saint-Germain in the deserted Rue Blomet, which is now called Rue Plumet, not far from the spot which was then designated as Combat des Animaux. This house was composed of a single-storied pavilion, 2 rooms on the ground floor, 2 chambers on the first floor, a kitchen downstairs, a boudoir upstairs, an attic under the roof, the whole preceded by a garden with a large gate opening on the street. This garden was about 1.5 acres in extent. This was all that could be seen by passers-by, but behind the pavilion there was a narrow courtyard, and at the end of the courtyard, a low building consisting of 2 rooms and a cellar, a sort of preparation destined to conceal a child and nurse in case of need. This building communicated in the rear by a masked door which opened by a secret spring, with a long, narrow, paved winding corridor, open to the sky, hemmed in with 2 lofty walls, which, hidden with wonderful art, and lost as it were between garden enclosures and cultivated land, all of whose angles and detours it followed, ended in another door, also with a secret lock which opened 1/4 of a league away, almost in another quarter, at the solitary extremity of the Rue du Babylone. Through this the Chief Justice entered, so that even those who were spying on him and following him would merely have observed that the justice betook himself every day in a mysterious way somewhere, and would never have suspected that to go to the Rue du Babylone was to go to the Rue Blomet. Thanks to clever purchasers of land, the magistrate had been able to make a secret, sewer-like passage on his own property, and consequently without interference. Later on he had sold in little parcels, for gardens and market gardens, the lots of ground adjoining the corridor, and the proprietors of these lots on both sides thought they had a party wall before their eyes, and did not even suspect the long, paved ribbon winding between 2 walls amid their flower beds and their orchards. Only the birds beheld this curiosity. It is probable that the linnets and tomtits of the last century gossiped a great deal about the Chief Justice. The pavilion, built of stone in the taste of mansard, wainscoted and furnished in the Watteau style, rocaille on the inside, old-fashioned on the outside, walled in with a triple hedge of flowers, had something discreet, coquettish and solemn about it, as befits a caprice of love and magistracy. This house and corridor, which have now disappeared, were in existence 15 years ago. In '93 a coppersmith had purchased the house with the idea of demolishing it, but had not been able to pay the price. The nation made him bankrupt, so that it was the house which demolished the coppersmith. After that the house remained uninhabited, and fell slowly to ruin, as does every dwelling to which the presence of man does not communicate life. It had remained fitted with its old furniture, was always for sale or to let, and the 10 or a dozen people who passed through the Rue Plumet were warned of the fact by a yellow and illegible bit of writing which had hung on the garden wall since 1819. Towards the end of the Restoration, these same passers-by might have noticed that the bill had disappeared, and even that the shutters on the first floor were open. The house was occupied, in fact. The windows had short curtains, a sign that there was a woman about. In the month of October, 1829, a man of a certain age had presented himself, and had hired the house just as it stood, including, of course, the back building and the lane which ended in the Rue de Babylone. He had had the secret openings of the 2 doors to this passage repaired. The house, as we have just mentioned, was still very nearly furnished with the justice's old fitting. The new tenant had ordered some repairs, had added what was lacking here and there, had replaced the paving stones in the yard, bricks in the floors, steps in the stairs, missing bits in the inlaid floors and the glass in the lattice windows, and had finally installed himself there with a young girl and an elderly maidservant, without commotion, rather like a person who is slipping in than like a man who is entering his own house. The neighbours did not gossip about him, for the reason that there were no neighbours. This unobtrusive tenant was Jean Valjean. The young girl was Cosette. The servant was a woman named Toussaint, whom Jean Valjean had saved from the hospital and from wretchedness, and who was elderly, a stammerer, and from the provinces, 3 qualities which had decided Jean Valjean to take her with him. He had hired the house under the name of M. Fauchelevent, independent gentleman. In all that has been related heretofore, the reader has doubtless been no less prompt than Thénardier to recognize Jean Valjean. Why had Jean Valjean quitted the convent of the Petit Picpus? What had happened? Nothing had happened. It will be remembered that Jean Valjean was happy in the convent, so happy that his conscience finally took the alarm. He saw Cosette every day, He felt paternity spring up and develop within him more and more. He brooded over the soul of that child. He said to himself that she was his, that nothing could take her from him, that this would last indefinitely, that she would certainly become a nun, being thereto gently incited every day, that thus the convent was henceforth the universe for her as it was for him, that he should grow old there, and that she would grow up there, that she would grow old there, and that he should die there, that, in short, delightful hope, no separation was possible. On reflecting upon this, he fell into perplexity. He interrogated himself, he asked himself if all that happiness were really his, if it were not composed of the happiness of another, of the happiness of that child which he, an old man, was confiscating and stealing. If that were not theft, he said to himself, that this child had a right to know life before renouncing it, that to deprive her in advance, and in some sort without consulting her, of all joys, under the pretext of saving her from all trials, to take advantage of her ignorance of her isolation, in order to make an artificial vocation germinate in her, was to rob a human creature of its nature and to lie to God. And who knows if, when she came to be aware of all this some day, and found herself a nun to her sorrow, Cosette would not come to hate him, a last, almost selfish thought, and less heroic than the rest, but which was intolerable to him. He resolved to quit the convent. He resolved on this, he recognized with anguish the fact that it was necessary. As for objections, there were none. 5 years' sojourn between these 4 walls and of disappearance had necessarily destroyed or dispersed the elements of fear. He could return tranquilly among men. He had grown old, and all had undergone a change. Who would recognize him now? And then, to face the worst, there was danger only for himself, and he had no right to condemn Cosette to the cloister for the reason that he had been condemned to the galleys. Besides, what is danger in comparison with the right? Finally, nothing prevented his being prudent and taking his precautions. As for Cosette's education, it was almost finished and complete. His determination once taken, he awaited an opportunity. It was not long in presenting itself. Old Fauchelevent died. Jean Valjean demanded an audience with the revered prioress and told her that, having come into a little inheritance at the death of his brother, which permitted him henceforth to live without working, he should leave the service of the convent and take his daughter with him. But that, as it was not just that Cosette, since she had not taken the vows, should have received her education gratuitously, he humbly begged the reverend prioress to see fit that he should offer to the community, as indemnity, for the 5 years which Cosette had spent there, the sum of 5,000 francs. It was thus that Jean Valjean quitted the convent of the Perpetual Adoration. On leaving the convent, he took in his own arms the little valise, the key to which he still wore on his person, and would permit no porter to touch it. This puzzled Cosette, because of the odour of embalming which proceeded from it. Let us state at once that this trunk never quitted him more. He always had it in his chamber. It was the first and only thing sometimes that he carried off in his moving when he moved about. Cosette laughed at it and called this valise his inseparable, saying, "I am jealous of it." Nevertheless, Jean Valjean did not reappear in the open air without profound anxiety. He discovered the house in the Rue Plumet and hid himself from sight there. Henceforth he was in the possession of the name, Ultime Fauchelevent. At the same time he hired 2 other apartments in Paris, in order that he might attract less attention than if he were to remain always in the same quarter, and so that he could, at need, take himself off at the slightest disquietude which should assail him, and in short so that he might not again be caught unprovided as on the night when he had so miraculously escaped from Javert. These 2 apartments were very pitiable, poor in appearance, and in 2 quarters which were far remote from each other, the one in the Rue de l'Ouest, the other in the Rue de l'Armée. He went from time to time, now to the Rue de l'Armée, now to the Rue de l'Ouest, to pass a month or 6 weeks without taking Toussaint. He had himself served by the porters, and gave himself out as a gentleman from the suburbs, living on his funds, and having a little temporary resting place in town. This lofty virtue had 3 domiciles in Paris for the sake of escaping from the police.